Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network. Groong, I'm Asbed Bedrossian. This episode was recorded on Thursday, May 12th, 2022. In this Conversations on Groong episode, Hovik Manucharyan and I will be talking about the 2022 advocacy agenda at the Armenian National Committee of America, the ANCA for short. This is the largest grassroots organization advocating and promoting the views and values of Armenian Americans. To talk about these issues, we are joined by Aram Hamparian, who is the Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America. Thanks for joining us today, Aram.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we wanted to touch base with you because we've been seeing how active you and your entire organization, the ANCA, is. And we wanted to hear a little bit about your advocacy agenda for the balance of 2022. Can you give us a little bit of information, an overview?
Sure. Pretty much everything that we're doing is aligned with the security, the survival, the very viability of the Armenian homeland. And our actions in the end sort of fall into various baskets. There's obviously an Artsakh agenda, one about supporting and sustaining Artsakh, holding Azerbaijan and Turkey accountable, also justice for the Armenian Genocide. And around those three general baskets is a whole range of other issues. But at the very top of the list is holding Azerbaijan accountable. And that takes the form in DC of cutting U.S. military assistance to Baku. There's various ways to skin that cat. One of them is to encourage our president to enforce Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act. He did not do that last April, even in the wake of the 2020 war. Another path, alternate to that, is having Congress withdraw the president's authority or right to waive that law. And a third path is for Congress simply to zero out the assistance, to include language in a foreign aid bill or a defense authorization bill saying that none of the funds enacted under this law shall be used for security or military assistance to Azerbaijan. So that's a very, very strong focus of our efforts. We've testified before the House and Senate on that subject. We've worked on congressional letters, had legislators raise this issue multiple times during hearings in the House and Senate. But parallel to the holding Azerbaijan accountable is securing U.S. assistance to Artsakh. And Asbed, I can tell you that our government, under Democrat Republican administrations, has been very generous in helping people around the world, helping folks in Ethiopia or Burma or Yemen. We're spending billions and billions of dollars, but yet the amount of money that goes to Artsakh is like literally pennies. The $5 million that USAID talks about is $5 million that was promised by Mike Pompeo when he was Secretary of State, and he hasn't been Secretary of State for a year and a half now. So they've really decided, I think it's a policy decision, to starve Artsakh of assistance. No food aid, no water aid, no medicine, nothing. It's really shameful. The few dollars that they've shipped have been to help refugees who've left Artsakh, but nothing for Artsakh, which is really, really something wrong because it materially denies people assistance, but also because it sends the wrong signal that Azerbaijan gets a veto over how we share humanitarian assistance around the world. Third basket is the genocide issue. And on the genocide issue, in the wake of the two resolutions, the near unanimous resolutions in 2019, and then, of course, the president recognizing the genocide in 2021, we want to lock in that recognition. We don't want to see it roll back. And we've locked it in through the Library of Congress using the proper subject heading. We're locking it in now in terms of putting the U.S. government on record against denial, but also in terms of education. And we can talk about this more later. But the House is considering a measure that would allocate $10 million in assistance to help the Library of Congress help teachers teach about the Armenian Genocide. And it's a very, very
nice. Yes.
Yeah, it's a good measure. It's a very, very well-crafted measure by Congressman Carolyn Maloney, Gus Bilirakis. It's bipartisan, as is all of our work on the Hill. And then finally, we're going to roll this into a broader effort toward justice, toward reparations. So there's a bunch of different fronts. The education is kind of the tip of the spear today. But the long-term goal is a just resolution of this crime.
So let's talk a little bit about the issue of the U.S. providing latest generation fighter jets to Turkey. This issue came up, I think, when Turkey wanted to acquire some missile defense systems, the Patriot system, the Iron Dome system, and they were, I think, rejected. And then they went ahead and got the Russian S-400 system, which just precipitated a whole bunch of events, correct? I think the U.S. decided to exclude Turkey from the F-35 project, which they had been participating in the funding of this project. So they got excluded from that, and the relationship between the two countries really deteriorated. Can you tell us a little bit how we've gotten to the point where the Biden administration is restarting to consider selling Turkey F-16s and why?
Sure. The jets issue is, in a sense, in many ways, a barometer of the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and you're correct. So this does date back to the U.S. deciding to co-produce the F-35s with Turkey and other NATO allies. And that process took place. And as we moved toward production of those weapon systems, Turkey asked to purchase U.S. Patriot missiles. The U.S. denied that request based on security, technology, licenses, potential for third-party transfer. It was felt like it was an unreasonable risk for the U.S. to take. Turkey responded to that, not by trying to meet the conditions that the U.S. had set, but rather by purchasing Russian S-400 missiles, which are the most advanced Russian anti-aircraft system. So now the U.S. in turn imposed sanctions on Turkey because they were now purchasing major weapons systems from Russia. And the U.S. took them legislatively, and eventually the executive branch as well, took them out of the F-35 program. And that was a point of considerable tension. It's a project that we worked on for many years. We partnered with the Hellenic American Leadership Council for many years. We took an ad out in the New York Times on this, it must be like 4 years ago now. And a lot of folks in DC said, wow, you're going to take on the defense industry. And we're like, yeah, we think it's a bad idea. And little by little, the momentum built around the issue. And a lot of big stakeholders came in. A lot of heavy hitting senators came in and said, we just can't have Turkey on both sides of the S-400 and the F-35s because they co-locate each other.
I wanted to ask why some of these exclusions have happened on the part of the United States. Like you said, there were technology transfer concerns with Turkey. Most of the time they talk about the valued NATO ally, Turkey, right? Is Turkey really considered an unreliable ally of the United States that these issues keep arising?
Yeah, I think the general consensus in Washington is that Turkey, much like Pakistan, is a legacy partner. They're coasting on decades of experience and decades of partnership. But that they're today entitled to things that they no longer deserve, but somehow are, as I said, a legacy. They're like legacy partners. So the serious thinkers in DC, technically view Turkey as a NATO ally, but as a practical matter, don't trust Turkey. And then there's gradations of that. There are those who want to salvage it, those who want to jettison it. But the general consensus, I would say, in DC is a very, very critical view of Turkey that is in letter an ally, a NATO ally, but in spirit is not an ally anymore.
Okay.
Aram, I really love seeing collaboration between Armenian advocacy groups, and in this case, we saw your partnership with the Hellenic American advocacy groups. I've also seen some, I believe, Indian American groups. So can you tell us how that relationship developed, and whether there will be more in the future of this type of partnership? And where are the common areas of mutual benefit?
Sure. Let me start by saying this. In a community like ours, which is highly motivated, highly networked, but not very large, needs coalition strategies. That's got to be the bread and butter of your advocacy. So we look at every aspect of our advocacy agenda and then set a coalition strategy for that. So you may have noticed that when we wrote to the executive branch against the waiver of Section 907, that letter was signed by multiple coalition partners. When we saw the Genocide Education Act introduced, that was introduced with multiple coalition partners. And the same can be said on the jets, the No Jets for Turkey campaign. So natural allies, very easy natural allies are the Greek community and also the Kurdish community. Very different communities, but both highly motivated by a sense of identity, which is very, very deep. Then moving outside of that, there are issues-based coalitions. So groups that are, let's say, concerned about arms sales, or groups that are concerned about human rights or genocide prevention. So you have your identity partners and then your issue partners. And then I would say that one of the newest partners we have, it's now a couple of years old, is the Hindu American community, Americans of Indian heritage or of the Hindu faith. We have found multiple areas of overlap, multiple areas of common ground with our Indian friends, and we work literally day to day with the Hindu American Foundation, which is a remarkable group. They have a very, very strong focus on domestic issues, but also foreign affairs issues. And the major overlap is Turkey and Pakistan, two countries, as I said earlier, that are sort of legacy partners, but are highly problematic. And we both have an interest in seeing U.S. policy updated to reflect the Pakistan of today and the Turkey of today. Add to that deep cultural and civilizational ties between Armenians and Indians, going back, to the printing press that was established in India many, many years ago, going back to all the Indian students that study in Armenia, going back to the Armenian churches in various cities across the subcontinent. So there's a lot of areas for cooperation. I would say that there's a lot of asymmetry also in that we tend to be we're a much smaller community, but I would say perhaps a little more experienced on the advocacy front, whereas the Indian community is a bit larger and is sort of still in the early stages of its evolution as a political voice in America.
Nice. There's a lot of room for Armenian and Indian friendship. And I never get lazy informing my Indian friends about the Armenian heritage, for instance, in Calcutta. There was a recent article a few months ago, I forget in what magazine, but yeah, it's great to hear that. Aram, go on.
Well, let me add to that, Hovik, that we also have very, very profound and deep connections with Christian organizations here in Washington. The lead group is In Defense of Christians, but we work with Catholic groups, Orthodox groups, evangelical groups, and also have many partners in the Jewish American communities. The Genocide Education Act was introduced with multiple Jewish groups supporting its passage. I would say the significant distinction in terms of our partnership with the pro-Israel community is that we work particularly closely with those who can challenge and are willing to challenge Azerbaijan's aggression, and obviously we don't find much common ground with those pro-Israel groups that are pro-Aliyev, and they exist in DC, and we have to deal with that. But there are many groups. I'll give an example. The Middle East Forum is a group that is very, very pro-Israel, but also willing to hold Azerbaijan accountable, and they're a very trusted and close coalition partner.
Whenever these embargoes and technology issues come up, like the F-16s, I think that they are somewhat of a double-edged sword. If America is trying to exclude Turkey from the F-16s, they'll probably go ahead and try to come up with their own alternatives. Basically, they'll boot themselves up into new technologies. What is the line where we are doing the least amount of harm to our interests?
Well, I think Turkey will do what's good for Turkey. And if they felt that developing an indigenous capability was good for them, then they'll do that. And we're not going to have an impact one way or the other on that. So I don't think that we constrain Turkey by enabling their purchase of U.S. weaponry. I think the F-35 is a perfect example. They were excluded from the F-35s, I think, on the merits, and they came back and asked for the F-16s. So I don't think they're at the state. They'll do what they want to do, but given their interest in the F-16s, we have an interest in placing conditions on that. So, for example, we're not saying never sell Turkey weapons, and we're not asking for a divorce between the U.S. and Turkey, but we are saying these F-16s, if in fact they are sold or upgraded, we need guarantees that they will not be used against Armenians. They will not attack Cyprus or Greece, or be used domestically against Kurds, or in Syria against the Syriac or other Christian populations. So what we're saying is, okay, America wants to do business. There's a lot of profit to be made. We're not on principle against the idea of selling weapons, but we are against the idea that these weapons, subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer, enabled by acts of the U.S. Congress, will end up killing Armenians or Greeks or others. So
let's remember that these F-16s were directly used during the 44-day war against Armenian interests.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we do not forget that. And that is a very, very important driver of exactly what we're doing today.
Expanding on that a little bit, I'm still shocked that Turkey was able to build its Bayraktar drone. However successful people think it is, it's sometimes people say it's like it's used more for marketing and it wasn't really key. But in any case, there is some reason to believe that, yes, it's a very powerful weapon nowadays. And it was based mainly off of U.S. commercial parts. For instance, Garmin. What is the ANCA doing on that front? And here's, something that I didn't think would need a specific guarantee, which is U.S. commercial technology that is not meant for military export, is not meant for military grade. What kind of rules in NATO would allow Turkey to purchase these surreptitiously, basically on the open market, and then use it in machines that kill people? Okay. And how would U.S.
No, it's really just exactly the right question to ask. And Congressman Brad Sherman from Southern California asked exactly that question of the Congressional Research Service, the research arm of the U.S. Congress, and asked what policies govern the transfer of U.S. parts, commercial or dual use or military, to a foreign country, which then uses them in some offensive capacity or in committing human rights abuses. And the Congressional Research Service prepared a 10-page report assessing that issue. They didn't make a final conclusion, but they did say, here's the legal context in which the executive branch should make a judgment on this issue. It's a legitimate issue, and it requires it's a bit of a gray area, because you can literally buy, let's say, the GPS system could be bought off the shelf. And the same can be said of like 8 or 9 different components in the system. We know that the optics came from Canada, from Westcam. Mm-hmm. But we took that report and shared it with the executive branch and said, okay, here is the framework within which you need to examine this. As it turns out, even though it's a military question, the State Department is the one tasked with evaluating whether or not a U.S. arms export law was violated. And we asked one-on-one, we asked very senior people at the department, here's the framework, Congress has provided that, now examine this. To my knowledge, they said they say, as they always say, that they take these issues very seriously, and then I'm pretty sure they ignored it entirely. But we made the direct request, and then we also pursued it indirectly. So you may have followed last year during the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 22, the House adopted a very strong amendment put forward by Congressman Cardenas of California in partnership with other members, including Adam Schiff and Sherman and others, an amendment that required a Department of Defense, Department of State report on the presence of U.S. components and technology in the Turkish drones deployed by Azerbaijan to kill Armenians. And that passed the House. We're very encouraged by that. We were a big part of making that happen. It went to the Senate. They adopted a weaker version, and the compromise measure that was ultimately signed into law by the president made a generic call on the executive branch to look into third country parts and components used in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So it's not what we wanted, right? We wanted a much more stringent, focused investigation, but nonetheless, the executive branch is now obliged in the next month or two to produce a report to Congress. It may be classified, we may never see it. Parts of it may be declassified, and we certainly will see those parts. But we're looking into what third-party components played a role in the weaponry deployed in that conflict. And the evidence is clear. It's clear that multiple parts, as many as 10 in the Bayraktars, were either produced in the U.S. or by firms with subsidiaries or affiliates in the U.S. So that's a super important issue for us, Hovik.
And I know that we have to move on, but I really, really am irked by this issue. Have you contacted the corporations themselves that we identified? And what was their response? I mean, is Garmin continuing to sell these parts to Turkey?
Garmin was actually one of the more forthcoming groups, and they promised to look into it and put a stop to sales such as this. They were good. A couple others. It was some spectrum. I don't have all the info right in front of me, but it was some spectrum of like, yes, we get it, we'll stop, to not people. A couple just didn't get back to us. There were protests, as you recall, outside some of their headquarters. Mm-hmm. I think it was Xilinx sent us an email saying, we will take steps to safeguard this and that. And then we said, well, we're really happy that you sent us an email. Why don't you post that on your website, or why don't you send us that on your letterhead? And they never got back to us. I think they were involved in a big merger at the time with AMD or something, and probably their lawyers didn't want to do it. So some spectrum of responsiveness. There's really two issues here. Number one is, should those corporations police themselves? The answer is yes. Will they? Well, they'll make that call. Should the U.S. government conduct oversight of this as potential violations of U.S. arms export law? Well, the Congressional Research Service said there's plenty of cause for an investigation and for action, perhaps. But as far as we can tell, the executive branch has not taken action, and that's very disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, the executive branch is really, I think, a lost cause for Armenians. They, especially as tensions with Russia or geopolitical tensions in general, it seems like they have a carte blanche. But I think many corporations nowadays have offices of social responsibility. They should, that's what I'm trying to get at. I think that maybe if Armenians were more vigilant as a consumer, and if ANCA maybe, I'm sure you have done a lot of this, but if we showed our strength both as an advocacy group and as a consumer with these corporations and try to sort of bombard them with questions, with pressure them into being more socially responsible and more responsible in general in how they who and to whom and how they sell these parts to. I think that maybe that's more an area that needs to be explored. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that we should move and are moving, not fast enough, toward matching our government relations sort of track with like a corporate relations track, because a lot of the harms against the Armenian people are corporate driven.
Right.
I look at what counterparts in Canada were able to do with Westcam, and eventually, putting a stop to arms exports to Azerbaijan. I believe also some limitations on arms exports to Turkey. So like they were able to deliver that. We have not yet.
Okay.
Aram, you mentioned U.S. foreign aid a few minutes ago, and I want to come back around to that topic. First of all, I'll just say, for myself, I've never been a big supporter of U.S. foreign aid. Frankly, I think the U.S. has a lot of domestic issues where we could spend our own money, but we are choosing to throw this U.S. Treasury away, currently, for example, at $50 billion of commitment in Ukraine, and we bicker at home to allocate money for COVID support, money for homeless shelters and things like that to the tune of 0.1% of that, or 0.01% of that. On the other hand, we see that the EU has made a very significant allocation of targeted loan guarantees for Armenia, something like 2.6 billion euros, and they've also allocated 2 billion for Azerbaijan. So those guys, the EU, are putting their money where their values and their goals are. Meanwhile, the US is just a source of demands, opinions, agendas. We see this day in and day out. In my opinion, the US aid does not reflect the demands it has of Armenia and the ambitions of the US foreign policy in the South Caucasus. What's your perspective on this? How do we convince the US of making $1 billion investment in Armenia's future and the partnership?
Sure. I share your skepticism, and I would add that foreign aid by any country, but certainly by the United States, is a tool of foreign policy. So the Europeans are putting their money perhaps not where their values are, but where their interests are. They might have an interest, say, in securing alternate non-Russian sources of energy. And if putting some money into the Armenian system makes Armenia more malleable, or more flexible, or more willing to make concessions, then that's an investment. It's not an act of compassion or kindness. Mm-hmm. And the same can be said of our USA program. The word assistance is used. That's like the common word. Aid.
Right.
We want to aid Armenia, or we want to assist Armenia. But very often the assistance does exactly the opposite. So the U.S. meddles in Armenian domestic life in ways that we as Americans would resent if other countries did in our domain, right? So we meddle, play favorites in the Armenian political system, and then complicate Armenia's regional relationships, which,
right.
Armenia's in a tough neighborhood. It really has enough challenge dealing with its neighbors without foreign assistance programs, like I always say, assistance programs with quotes around the word assistance.
Without considering superpower politics.
Yeah, without just people like coming and making life difficult. It's like, the irony is that it's not assistance. It's very, very often just the opposite. So real assistance would contribute to Armenia's survival, its viability, its security. That's what Armenia needs today. Armenia faces existential threats. And, I'll give an example. And this is one that it happened maybe less than 6 months after the 2020 attack by Azerbaijan. Mm-hmm. We focused extremely heavily on getting immediate assistance to Artsakh because there were so many refugees and people were in such difficult circumstances. And pushed with the executive branch. Every meeting we had, every letter we sent every testimony we offered, everything that we did with our coalition partners was focused on stopping the military aid to Azerbaijan and sending humanitarian aid to Artsakh. And we pushed, and the money was like coming out in with an eyedropper, a little bit for demining and something for the refugees who left, but nothing for actually to help people in Artsakh, right? So if you're a family in Artsakh and they lost their father, maybe lost a son, and they need some help to survive, nothing for them. But the first aid package that was announced post-war was some kind of like judicial reform or some kind of police reform. It begs the question, is that what the Armenian people needed at that time?
Is that the highest priority?
No, first of all, it's not only a high priority. If you want to be really cynical about it, it's again playing favorites within the political system, mm-hmm. and bolstering a particular part of the Armenian political landscape against another part of the Armenian political landscape in order to somehow try to move the chess pieces in Yerevan in support of a foreign policy agenda, which sadly is a pro-Azeri foreign policy agenda. And the test of this, and I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here for a second, Asbed and Hovik, is that if you want to measure U.S. foreign policy or understand U.S. foreign policy post-war, the root of it is, at its base, it's something like the United States knows very well that Azerbaijan committed an unprovoked act of aggression. They know that in large part because they have an intelligence community that monitors the region very closely. And second, this is free. Ilham Aliyev says so all the time, right? So even if you don't have a CIA or an NSA, you still have Ilham Aliyev, saying loudly, standing on the rooftops, yelling, "I did this."
There's a public admission of guilt.
Yeah, public admission of guilt. Plus, we assume a lot of intelligence. So the United States knows very well Azerbaijan's the aggressor, but will not say so, and still plays this idiotic game of offensive to everybody who respects the truth. This idiotic game of, well, both sides. We call on both sides, this and that, an artificial parity and even-handedness that is not warranted. So everything then flows from that policy. So the lack of aid to Artsakh, the continuation of military assistance to Azerbaijan, the lack of focus on the prisoners, the lack of focus on the U.S. parts in the Bayraktar drones, the use of mercenaries, the use of prohibited munitions, all of these cascade down from that core failure. And that's where we are today. So now, if you accept as the premise that the U.S. policy is artificially tilted against the facts, against any sense of morality toward Azerbaijan, then you might say, okay, then the U.S. aid programs will align with that policy, and they'll be used not necessarily to assist Armenians, but when they throw out a thing like, okay, we're going to reform the police in Armenia, it's like, I think a seventh grader, maybe a sixth grader, fourth grader would understand the game that's being played here. It's a matter of using this assistance to play favorites in the Armenian political system to advance an agenda, frankly, or a policy that is one that's pro-Azeri. And the evidence of that, again, is that even after all these months, we cannot say what Ilham Aliyev shouts every single day.
Aram, I'm going to take a tangent. I know in the past you have partnered closely with the government of Armenia towards many of your issues, many of the issues that you're fighting for. When it comes to the issue of aid to Artsakh, what kind of support have you received from the government of Armenia? And I hate asking this question, but could they have, could the government of Armenia, for instance, is there an example of support like in the past where the government of Armenia has stepped in and that has influenced decision making in Washington? And is the same level of support being received today by you?
We've cooperated with the governments of Armenia going back to the first days of independence, even before independence, frankly, and have done so while respecting the various strictures about church and state. The idea of like there's a domestic Armenian American community and a foreign government, and obviously we have our role and they have their role, but nonetheless we talk all the time, and there's often areas where we're on the same page, and that I think took place during Bedrossian and Manucharyan and Sarkisian, and more or less successfully. I think that generally speaking, it's something like the diasporans tend to be a little bit more aggressive, not just in America but around the world, a little pushing the envelope a little bit more. Diplomats need to be a little more reserved, a little more risk averse, and that's perfectly understandable. It's part of the complementarity that our large diaspora affords us. I don't think we're in the same situation today. I think that the sense I get, and I'm sure there are people with a lot of thoughts on these issues, but I get the sense that for perhaps domestic political reasons, the government in Yerevan today can't find the will or the interest or the desire to cooperate constructively with diasporan advocacy movements, the high tide movement, let's say, around the world. And in fact, very often they set a ceiling on what can be accomplished. So if we walk into an office, whatever office this is, and in the U.S. government, let's say a stakeholder on U.S. aid to Artsakh, and we make the case for aid to Artsakh, it's very likely that they have not heard a similar message from a representative of the current government. So that, in a sense, sets a ceiling. It sets a ceiling on how seriously an issue will be taken. So if we say, for example, Artsakh should be free. Artsakh should not be part of Azerbaijan. If Artsakh is part of Azerbaijan, the people there will be killed, either driven out or killed. If we make that argument, but they hear no similar argument from Yerevan, right, that creates some space. And DC is, if nothing else, it's a beautiful city, but it's a city full of, I don't know, maybe wolves, maybe snakes.
Well, that's definitely the obvious example. It's a heartbreaking example, and we all sort of struggle with that, trying to process that daily, that the government of Armenia is acting against the interests of Armenians in Artsakh and in Armenia. But and maybe it was a little bit general, your answer, but like, is there some more specific, for instance, in terms of like aid directly to Artsakh, what specific agenda items, what specific proposals have you put forth, and what could you expect from the Armenian government in terms of support for those proposals that isn't or is happening?
Do you mean where would the money go in Artsakh, Hovik? Like if
like for instance, Aram said that the U.S. government has supported people who have refugees who have left Artsakh, but no money directly to projects in Artsakh themselves. Are there some like proposed projects for helping Artsakhis themselves, which have not materialized? For one reason or another.
Well, first let me say this: that we did see a very constructive letter drafted by the deputy speaker of the Armenian parliament, written to legislative leaders in the U.S., multiple legislative leaders in the U.S., documenting the needs in Artsakh and offering to work with U.S. legislators and other stakeholders to craft a U.S. aid program for Artsakh. That was Ishkan Sakatelyan. So, he is the number 2 guy in the parliament, maybe doesn't have as much power as that title might indicate, but nonetheless holds an important title. And on his letterhead, sent a letter to the Congress saying, my colleagues and I have been to Artsakh. We've seen these needs, and he outlined the needs in terms of water and food and shelter and rehabilitation. And so there are constructive voices in Yerevan on this issue, number 1. Number 2, you may have seen that the Armenian caucus sent a letter to the key appropriators on the Hill, on the House side, and they asked for at least $50 million in assistance to Artsakh, and we worked with them on crafting that request. And again, that went through the various priorities. At the very top of the list that they proposed, and also in the language that we proposed in our testimony, water security is at the very, very top of the list. We can survive without many things, not without water, and we know what Azerbaijan has done to restrict the water flow into Artsakh. It'll get worse now, as we head into the summer months. So water's at the very top of the list. And the fact of the matter is, Hovik, we obviously want as much support as possible, and we would welcome anybody who was pushing for aid to Artsakh, but the lack of support from any quarter, we simply cannot afford to lose a step, right? And if I see that others aren't being helpful, the only conclusion I draw is, well, we have to work that much harder, and we have to work that much more effectively. And the United States government should be providing, helping with water security and food security, and with shelter and refugees, and especially rehabilitation for those who lost limbs or were otherwise injured in the war.
Where would you like to see American assistance for Armenia to be? Dollar levels.
I mean, the number we threw out was $250 million. I think the number that the caucus, the Armenian caucus proposed was 50 for Artsakh, 100 for Armenia. I would say as important as the number is the nature, right? And the nature of the assistance. If it's going to be one more set of lectures to the Armenian people about why they need to be more democratic, it's like, or why they're broken, or why they need to be fixed. To hell with that. To hell with that. Armenia does not need and should not have to suffer another lecture from anybody on any subject. We need help surviving. The irony of this, and the way to test this proposition, is to look across the border and say, how does Aliyev deal with American lectures about democracy? Well, the fact is, they don't get American lectures about democracy. If maybe 10 or 20 years ago, some brave diplomat, brave and perhaps foolish diplomat, offered a lecture to Ilham Aliyev, he got sent packing, right? And so the asymmetry is remarkable, and it all points to the fact that U.S. policy is something like, free pass for Azerbaijan, endless lectures for Armenia.
They're not democratic. Why would you lecture them about democracy?
I guess, yeah.
And the second part of that is, where would you like, or how would you like to make it so that there's a much greater level of foreign direct investment in Armenia?
Well, a good program that our government has not taken advantage of is the Millennium Challenge grant. which was
Right.
given some years ago, many years ago, for roads and irrigation, but should be renewed for STEM education in Armenian schools. And that would help with Armenia's security on many levels. It would create employment. It would create export opportunities. So I would say that education and through the Millennium Challenge Grant would be the ideal path.
And just to clarify, the Millennium Challenge Grant was stopped after the March 1 riots. Officially, it was stopped because Armenia sort of graduated out of the needy category, but the alternative interpretation was that was as a punishment for the Armenian government's response on March 1st, 2008. But even like if we take the official response, like, I think that over the last 2 years, poverty in Armenia has significantly increased. So I don't know how they measure the need and the level of Armenia, but yeah, that should be reviewed, I think.
Hovik, I would say where there's a will, there's a way.
Yes.
Your listeners could just simply check out how Georgia somehow made the cut, but Armenia did not. And it's like, you know what? Where there's a will, there's a way. If U.S. policymakers wanted to get Millennium Challenge to Armenia, they would. If they felt like the rules prohibited them from helping Georgia, well, somehow they ended up ignoring those.
Aram, let's go to your third item in your agenda, which I think was the Armenian Genocide. So just a week ago, the state of Mississippi recognized the Armenian Genocide, bringing the count to 50 states that have individually recognized our genocide. So basically, every state is done, right? My question is, what is the significance of each state individually recognizing the Armenian Genocide, in addition to the federal government's formal recognition, which was basically completed when Biden formally recognized it last year in 2021, on top of the House and Senate recognitions in 2019?
I think it shows that the recognition of the Armenian Genocide is a bottom-up issue, one that has a very long history in the United States, going back to the time of the Near East Relief Foundation. Americans mobilized a century ago around the massacres of the Armenians, and they have remained engaged on the issue. And what we're showing is that that many municipalities, now all 50 states, the U.S. House by a vote of 405 to 11, and the U.S. Senate with a unanimous vote have recognized this crime. That it's not like sometimes the Turkish government likes to say something that, well, the Armenian lobby, lobby on America, and it's in fact sort of a deeply rooted issue in the American psyche. And I think that the 50 states reflect that, but there's also many other things. I mean, the work we did to get the New York Times and the Associated Press and others to stop using qualifiers or quotations around Armenian genocide. This was a sustained effort.
Well, funny you mentioned the New York Times, because the New York Times had extensive documentation of the genocide as it was happening in 1915. So the consciousness in this country has been, from Morgenthau on, right, has been present.
Yes. We could use a Morgenthau today.
You're not kidding. Friends of the Armenians in Congress have recently introduced a bill to promote genocide education. I think you called it the Genocide Education Project.
Education
can you talk a little bit about this bill and the goals?
Sure. It's a bipartisan measure introduced by Carolyn Maloney and Gus Polarakis, a Democrat from New York, Republican from Florida. And basically, it calls for $10 million over 5 years to fund the Library of Congress to prepare programs and materials that educate American school children about the Armenian Genocide. It makes
excellent.
Focuses very directly on countering denial and the hate and toxicity of Armenian genocide denial. It is similar to legislation that was introduced and enacted dealing with the Holocaust. In that case, the Holocaust Museum was the agency that dealt with producing the materials. In this case, it's the Library of Congress. I think I mentioned earlier, the Library of Congress for about a century used the phrase Armenian massacres. With the adoption by Congress of the genocide resolutions, they switched that. And now if you look up a book under the subject heading Armenian Genocide, you'll find all the books that you might like to find. Whereas in the past, even books with Armenian Genocide in the title were cataloged as Armenian massacres, which is, obviously, it was like really a terrible thing that the Turks imposed.
Terrible and ridiculous. Yeah.
Outside of genocide education, what is next? In Armenia, there was a big debate a few years ago over the motto of the Armenian Genocide Institute, which is to remember and to demand. What are we going to do on the issue of demanding? Yeah, any potential plans that you have on that?
Well, yes, I think we're taking it one step at a time. And the first step was get the recognition in place, then lock it in. And there are multiple steps to lock it in so it can't be reversed. Then education, and then we move on to more justice-oriented or reparations issues. The principle, I think it's a very simple principle, common among, I think, every civilization on the planet, that when a wrong has occurred, you try to make the victim whole to the extent possible. You return what can be returned, and you compensate what cannot be returned. That's the general principle. That exists, Hovik, at least three levels. One is the level of individual claims, and we've seen people make individual claims, and that's important, but just one level. The second is institutional, and that usually takes the form of religious institutions. And we saw Aram Hamparian, pursue that issue through the courts, both in Turkey and in Europe.
Right.
And then third, I think, which is the most significant, is the national level, the question of viability. Because ultimately, right, we want to see churches return, we want to see people made whole, but ultimately, the harm of the genocide was against the very viability of the Armenian people. So where would we be today had that not occurred? Something like 20, 25 million people occupying a large area, stretching, across the indigenous Armenian homeland of centuries, of millennia, right? So to be made whole from that crime is an aim. That requires a number of stakeholders, including in Yerevan. The Genocide Convention does provide a vehicle or avenue for redress, but it's one that needs to be pursued at the national level. There are things that we can do short of that at the national level, and we're pursuing them. We work in partnership with the Armenian Legal Center on that. So, stay tuned. We'll be eager to share our progress on that front.
Just to sort of go a little bit deeper, if, for instance, you want to take Turkey, the government of Turkey, to court for genocide or reparation, I believe in ICJ, it requires the government of Armenia to initiate. Is that correct? One of the courts,
the stakeholder, right, to have standing in that arena, you need to be a state, and and we need to work. We need to work toward that day.
Well, we talked about that, so that's why I wanted to sort of remind our listeners that on this specific issue, specifically on ICJ, it requires the state to act, and we have talked a countless number of times in the past on how there's pressure from the government of Turkey within the context of normalization of relations to cede any claims or to basically stop,
Let me give you an example that I think you might find interesting. So, and he's a friend of Erdogan's and known as a senior diplomat, pretty aggressive, but he's been relatively quiet since he arrived here. I think it was early this year, and hasn't done a lot of Hill work. Perhaps because the Hill is not very receptive today to hearing what Turkey has to say. Maybe they figure just less engagement might be the better approach at this time. He has come out of hiding, not on Ukraine, not on Syria, not on Iran, not on any other issues that you might imagine, but on the Armenian Genocide Education Act. So he has his lobbyists, and we're able to follow what they do through a variety of means. So his lobbyists are scheduling meetings for him on the Hill to talk about, as I said, not Iran, not Ukraine, not Russia, not S-400s, not F-35s, not F-16s, but to talk about the Armenian Genocide Education Act. If ever Armenians, our fellow Armenians, wonder how seriously Turkey takes this issue, it's really no wonder at all. They center this issue in their diplomacy and attach a lot of significance to it and devote a lot of capital to it. So Mehmet Merchan is going to be up on the Hill arguing why American school children should not learn about the Armenian genocide. It's like remarkable.
Wow.
Speaking of all these Turkish people on the Hill, most people are peripherally aware of this Dr. Oz person, who has recently moved, I think, from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, and he's now a Republican candidate to the U.S. Senate. The open seat from Pat Toomey, was it? From Pennsylvania. And I think the ANCA has called for the DOJ to have an investigation into his ties with Turkey. What is this about, Aram?
Sure. We actually took a very, very careful legal look at his relationship with Turkish Airlines. So our concern about Dr. Oz and Turkish Airlines is that he represents them not simply in a commercial sense, but also in a political sense. Turkish Airlines is owned 49% by the Turkish Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is controlled by Erdogan, but everybody knows that the rest of the corporation is effectively controlled by the Erdogan government. When he represents them in a political capacity, he then moves into the domain of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. He should have registered as a foreign agent for Turkey. We feel that that's a potential violation and requires scrutiny by the Department of Justice. But it goes far beyond that. He has found the time to vote in Turkish elections, but missed U.S. elections. He swore an oath to the Turkish military and chose to serve in the Turkish military. He has been an apologist for Erdogan. He has refused to recognize the Armenian Genocide, despite multiple opportunities to address that issue. All of these issues combined lead us to believe that he would be the wrong choice for Pennsylvanians in the U.S. Senate. We're making a very, very aggressive effort to educate voters in Pennsylvania, especially Republican voters who are heading to the primary on Tuesday. You may have seen that we had an op-ed published in the Washington Times, which is read by Republicans. We were written up in the New York Post, in Forbes, in the Daily Caller, in Daily Wire, Breitbart, and others. We really made a focused effort to reach out to Republican primary voters in Pennsylvania, obviously not just Armenians, all voters, and to educate them on this issue in the hopes that on careful review, they'll decide to vote for anybody else. Our view on the election is anybody but us.
And what I'm hearing is this is just not an Armenian issue with a Turkish American. It's actually his allegiances seem to be quite divided.
To the point where the former Secretary of State Pompeo did a press conference to call out Oz, and he raised the rhetorical question: why is it that he had time and focus and energy to vote in a Turkish election, but couldn't bother to vote in a U.S. election? And his point was something like, well, it may be entirely innocent, but let's hear it out, right? And if he did, in fact, as I think he did, take an oath to the Turkish military when he joined the Turkish military, and if part of that oath is an allegiance to his, I think the phrase is his supervisors, right? Has he renounced that oath? Is that still in force? These are like legitimate questions for Pennsylvania voters, and they've been raised by the other candidates as well. If he does make it through the primary, I'm convinced. I think that he'll hear these issues from his general election opponent as well.
Yeah, I think Mike Pompeo actually called him a threat to national security. So let's talk a little bit more generally about the 2022 and 24 cycles in the U.S. elections. You recently posted that some contested 2024 California primaries might provide opportunities for our community, the Armenian community here in California, in the upcoming presidential elections. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Asbed, let me just take one step back and just give a conceptual framework, and then I'll talk about the elections. Okay. So the ANCA, and more generally Armenian advocacy in the U.S., you can think about it as existing on three planes. The highest plane might be geopolitics, and that would be, where does Armenia fit into the geopolitical thinking of senior U.S. decision makers? And you have issues dealing with Russia and Iran and Syria and the Caspian energy and NATO. So there's a geopolitical context, and then where does Armenia fit in that context? And often that's a challenging environment, but nonetheless one where you make the case. You make the geopolitical case to the extent that you can, and you hope to persuade people to a view that's aligned with Armenian security. So that's a geopolitical level. Another level, let's say a second tier, would be civilizational or cultural. And it might be something like Armenia has deep European roots. Armenia is a democratic society. Armenia is a Christian nation. Armenia has a diaspora that anchors it to the outside world. Those are civilizational things. So, for example, when the Museum of the Bible has an exhibit on Armenian Christmas, and hundreds and hundreds of Americans who are at the Bible Museum get to learn about the Christian roots of Armenia, that's the civilizational level, also very important. And you need to be active on both those levels. In any given instance, doesn't mean that you're going to prevail because you engage, but you need to engage on both of those levels. The third is where I would say the bulk of our effort comes in, and that's the constituency level, right? What actual leverage do we have in the system? In geopolitics, leverage is not how I would describe our presence in the geopolitical matrix of the world, right? We tend to be the object more than the subject of geopolitics, right? So
the punching bag.
Oh, punching. Okay. So we have the geopolitical level, then the civilization level, where you have to be engaged and build coalitions and create understanding and all that. But the constituency level is where the thing we can control the most right? And the thing that if we work effectively, we can maximize our influence. And we're always looking for opportunities. So in any given district, congressional district, we might have some leverage and we want to maximize that. And we have a strategy literally for 435 districts. How can we maximize our presence in each and every one? And we track that using data at a very granular level. But also, there are various iterations of the US political process where we can exert leverage. I'll give an example. In 2008, for reasons that I don't understand, California decided to have an early primary. And you may remember that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were competing in that primary.
Remember, yeah.
The race had yet to be decided by the time the primaries reached, I think it was an early March primary.
Yes.
Before they reached California. So that was an example where, okay, California, because of the timing, because of the nature of the race and all the rest, both candidates felt the need to really address and engage with the Armenian American community. That was 2008. Since then, California's moved the primary around a little bit, and I'm not sure exactly where it's going to be next time. But if, in fact, 2024 presidential primaries are competitive, certainly they'll be competitive on the Republican side, and they may be competitive on the Democratic side. We'll see. That will represent another moment in the history of our community where we can maximize our leverage in the system. And that's not a moral case. That's not a geopolitical argument. That's actual leverage. And then we have to never ignore the geopolitical, never ignore the moral, but really focus on the leverage, on the political. So that's looking ahead. The next sort of major point of leverage in the American political system will very likely be the 2024 primary. So as you're moving through 2023, it'll be our job to make sure that the candidates understand that the Armenians are not a cheap date, that we have expectations, that we need to see deliverables before Election Day. And I think that it's far out, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done before then. And certainly we're not placing all our bets on 2024, yes. But that does represent sort of on the horizon an important moment for us.
With November 2020, I found, at least within my social circles, that there are different types of reactions. Some have been devoted to the homeland and realizing that maybe this is a chance that cannot be missed. Others, there's been some kind of a schism between different Armenians and also of political groups, and also between Armenia and the diaspora itself. Specifically, I know some people who say, I will not collaborate. I will not send money. I will not collaborate with the current government of Armenia. And then there's a whole bunch of Armenians who have essentially withdrawn, whether it's apathy, whether it's I'm in depression. But how has that affected the ANCA? How has it affected your funding, for instance? And has that introduced any new challenges in your work?
Okay, I think in response to your question, I'll take this approach. Generally speaking, there are Armenians who view the Armenian nation from the perspective of a child, and there are others who view it from the perspective of a parent. And a child, especially a younger child, can complain and moan and say that they're not going to do stuff and hold their breath and all that stuff. That's a childish approach. It's not a bad approach, but it's a childish approach to being an Armenian. Right? Like, I'm entitled to this. I didn't get this. This is unfair. Why don't you do this differently? Can I do this? Or I want to go that. Like, that's that's a view of a petitioner, perhaps, or a child. And you know what? A lot of Armenians fall into that category, and some of them are like wonderful people, but not super productive. And then you have others who view the Armenian nation from the perspective of a parent, and a parent doesn't have the luxury of being depressed, doesn't have the luxury of throwing up their hands, doesn't have the luxury of running away, right? A parent is like, okay, these are my children. These are my children, and I'm going to care for them, period, end of sentence, until my last breath. I think that's the healthy approach. And I think that we've seen maybe a polarization with those on one side of the divide, maybe slipping a little farther toward the sort of a childish and petitioning and angry, dissatisfied approach, but also with folks who have a more of a parental view, assuming greater responsibility. And I think that's a healthy instinct. This goes back.
Aram, you being in Washington, D.C., I thought you were going to go back to John Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you."
Yeah. Well, actually, this goes back even far. I'll go back farther than John Kennedy. Although that's a great quote, drafted by Ted Sorensen, right? A great speechwriter. So But I'll go back even farther. I'll go back to Mikhail Nalbandian, Khachatur Abovyan, later on the writings of Rafi, and this idea of, what do you want to call it? Self-determination,
Yes.
responsibility, something. The idea that we cannot just be consumers of the Armenian project, we need to be producers of the Armenian experience, that we need to step up and own, right? Not just be acted upon, but to be the actors, right? And I think that was, in some ways, a counterculture to a pre-existing culture that had evolved in accommodation to the multiple empires that had ruled over the Armenians for century upon century. So if there were, let's say, Armenian parents 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago who felt that rebellion or assertion was not the right path, that it would lead to disaster, maybe they were justified in that, right? Maybe they felt like you couldn't rebel against the Sultan or the Tsar or the Shah, right? Okay, understandable. But in today's day and age, that doesn't work anymore, right? The idea of like, let's just accommodate, let's just be quiet, let's hope for the best. It's like very much an April 23rd approach to Armenian life. We can pretend that things are okay, but they're not, right? We need to have our eyes open and kind of put our Armenian burdens on our shoulders, carry our cross, and be adults about it. And I think we're seeing more of that. And I've seen people step up. Some of them have been a surprise to me. I didn't see it in them, and then people have stepped up. Others have drifted away because they just can't carry the burdens. But I think we're seing the emergence of kind of a new generation of Armenians
with their own Armenian identity.
Who look at the heavy burden of being Armenian, and they're like, yeah, I'll take that. Give me more. I can do it. And we work. They're exactly the allies that the ANCA works best with.
Do you think it's possible for an Armenian to dissociate themselves with the government of Armenia from the state of Armenia, but still consider themselves Armenian? Because that's also a popular thought nowadays with some diaspora circles saying, you know what, we've had it, and we're gonna focus on promulgation of Western Armenian, teaching Western Armenian, some things that are culturally important, but not necessarily advocating the agenda of the state of Armenia.
I'll give you my Aram Hamparian answer to that, which is I tend to meet everybody on their terms. So if someone shows up and they bring anything remotely healthy as an expression of their Armenian identity, that's great. And I don't like putting litmus tests. If someone shows up and their focus is teaching 10-year-olds Western Armenian, I'm like, bravo. And if another person is worried about the Artsakh aid program, another person, I'm at church every Sunday and I deal with every possible type of community member who, they're not, just because they're not doing, let's say, ANC work or they're not state building, it doesn't make them any lesser. And so I generally think, don't litmus test, just have a really, really big tent. The one place where I draw lines, and this is where I become a little more cynical as I get older, is if there's a foreign hand, sometimes you can smell it, and that's not a healthy thing. I'm a big believer that the Armenian nation, when it comes to decision making, we need to have a line, and within that space are the Armenians, and we can yell and scream and disagree. We can wrestle it out. That's all part of being a nation. We're not. It would be a strange thing indeed if we all just agreed on everything, right? But that should be our space. And when outsiders step into our space and they try to present their interests as our interests, we have to have the will and the courage to say, actually, you know what? This is not your space. Why don't you step outside? We're going to come to our conclusions, and we'll be glad to share them with you when we're done. And that applies east and west, whoever. But it's a big thing. Like I would say, for example, in DC, we have evolved to the point where we have an Armenian American voice, and it is a legitimate voice with integrity. And there are a lot of folks, a lot of ethnic groups in DC get used and abused by every group you can imagine, by the Democrats, by Republicans, by more powerful groups. And our approach has always been, look, this is who we are. We're strong, we're weak. You figure out how strong or weak you think we are, but we are who we are, and we know who we are, and we'll make decisions based on our understanding of ourselves. And that's a really good message. The fact that the genocide resolution took so long to pass was deeply painful for me and many others. But the fact that it passed 405-11, the fact that it passed in the Senate 100-0 sent a signal that we were not carried into the end zone.
Very important.
This was not carried. This was an authentic effort built in 50 states, built with members of Congress, congressional districts, states. It was our project, right? And I think people saw that and they're like, okay, the Armenians, however they want to gauge our strength, they're like, yeah, they pulled that off. That was them, not anybody else. Very important to never, and this is a huge problem, Hovik, that Armenians need to resist that. Like, don't be a tool of anybody else. And I'm most sensitive to this as an American, right? My family's been here now 100 plus years. It pains me when our U.S. assistance is sent to manipulate and to play favorites in the Armenian political context. That's not the role of our government. It should not be, and it certainly doesn't assist Armenia. If our assistance is actually help Armenia, it would help make Armenia more secure against foreign threats, against regional threats, and it would spend less time, trying to meddle.
All right. Fantastic conversation. Thank you, Aram. We're going to leave it there for today.
Thank you, Aram.
And we want to talk to you soon again.
Thank you so much, Asbed. Thank you, Hovik.
Take care.
Hugely grateful for your time today and for hosting me, and for more broadly for the great work that you guys do.
That concludes this Conversations on Groong episode, and we hope you found it useful. As always, we invite your feedback. You can find us on most social media and podcast platforms or our website, groong.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, like our pages, and follow us on social media. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.